So closing the wealth gap, that's the focus of our webinar tonight. And we're going to be talking about the wealth gap, what it is, as well as the role that financial education might play. As we kick off our webinar tonight, I want to talk about sort of what we're going to cover, just to preview that a little bit. We're going to focus at the beginning on what are called wicked problems. And I'm curious, I'm going to raise a question about that here in a minute, but then we'll dive into the racial wealth gap. We'll talk about root causes, the potential role. I've got potential in parentheses there for a reason, role of financial education. And then I have a whole host of different resources to share with you tonight. I could have made this into a months-long series or more, probably several courses even if we wanted to. I'm packing so much into tonight's webinar that it's kind of crazy, really. So I want to make sure that you all know that there is a handout. Or push that link out now. But this is a PDF that right now is in Google Drive, so you can access this later. It should have all of the different websites and sources of information. It's actually continues on to a second page, but this should have all of the different links and websites that I'll be sharing throughout the presentation tonight, so that you can go back and reference those, as well as all the different educational resources and books and videos and interactives and all sorts of stuff that I'm going to be talking about as we go through. So make sure that you grab that link and get that so that you can reference back to it later. So as we dive in, let's start off with wicked problems. So a number of you, I think, were on one of our first webinar of this series this year with Martha Rush. And Martha mentioned the concept of wicked problems. And if you were on that webinar, you might recall that Martha and I, one of the times that we've interacted over the years, is we both went to the same graduate, program at the University of Pennsylvania, and wicked problems were addressed in that. And I have to confess, I had never really heard the phrase wicked problems before. So if you can, find over on the Zoom bar that raise your hand. If you've heard of wicked problems before, raise your hand. If you're familiar with it, like as a concept, like what it is or what it's about. So so right now, so we have no hands raised. Okay, so good. Then that tells me where folks are. So a wicked problem, and this isn't just like, I always kind of think about somebody saying that in like I don't know, like a northeastern accent, right? Like from Boston, wicked, But anyhow, that's not where it comes from. A wicked problem is a social or cultural problem that is difficult or impossible to solve for as many as 4 reasons: incomplete or contradictory knowledge, the number of people and opinions involved, the large economic burden, and the interconnected nature of these problems with other problems. When I think about the racial wealth gap, which is what we're focusing on tonight, I can think, I think, it perfectly fits the definition of a wicked problem. And wicked problems are really hard to think about, to wrap your arms around, to figure out what's your role maybe as an educator, how to like tackle them, because they're huge. These big, huge, wicked problems, right? That's why how they get their name. So when we think about the wealth gap between races in particular, it's certainly a social or cultural problem. It is, I think, difficult or impossible to solve. It certainly hasn't been solved in the decades or century plus that it has existed. And I think it fits all of these different reasons, as well as these various characteristics. So I want to reference that these come from one of the original sort of thought leaders around wicked problems. So these are not my own. These are completely abbreviated from an original source, and I provided that along with some additional background information in the handout that was referenced earlier. But so there's no definitive formulation. That's one characteristic of a wicked problem. So for example, the racial wealth gap might change over time. It might look different in one place. So what the wealth gap looks like in my community might look different in your community or across the other side of the country. Depending on where we're looking at it, it can be formulated differently. It's hard, maybe even impossible to measure or claim success on wicked problems because they all bleed into one another, right? So, and we'll talk about some of this bleeding in a few minutes, but I imagine that you can think of things, actually over in the chat, I'd love it if you think like, what else do you think of when you think of the wealth gap, like bleeding into other problems? Like, what other things does it involve that you're like, well, it's kind of like all this big web of interconnectedness, right? So if you have some thoughts on that, feel free to post those over in the chat. I'd love to see those. The solutions to wicked problems can only be good or bad, not true or false. In other words, there is no like silver bullet way to solve a wicked problem. If there was, it wouldn't be a wicked problem, right? So solutions can be offered and they can help the problem, right, improve the situation, or they can make it worse. But they're not necessarily like a true or false. There's not, one good solution and one good solution only. There's no template to follow in solving these problems. History can provide a guide, but wicked problems, there's no like recipe for success, right? That's part of what makes them wicked, so to speak. There is always more than one explanation. And this is one of the things that really makes a wicked problem hard to wrap our arms around and sometimes makes people avoid wicked problems, right? And this notion of every wicked problem is a symptom of another problem. So we can think about the different things that the racial wealth gap are symptoms of, right? And we could have a whole list of them and things that then are can be attributed to the wealth gap, right? So there's just this incredible interconnectedness, ripple effect, web, whatever you want to call it. And then every wicked problem is unique. So just because we can come up with a way to attack one wicked problem, it doesn't mean that it's going to work for something else. They're all very unique and distinct. So other examples of wicked problems are things like poverty, right? We think about poverty, we think about how interconnected and messy that is as a huge cultural, social problem, right? It has to do with education, with incomes, with infrastructure, with just all sorts of different issues that all bleed into each other. Climate change, absolutely, a wicked problem. The challenges that we have with education, homelessness, sustainability. I saw food security, somebody commented as well. All of those absolutely examples of wicked problems. And so I'm going to challenge us to think about the wealth gap as a wicked problem, because truly it is. And I think that helps us to sometimes frame it and think about how we think about it, think about our role as educators in addressing it, attacking it, dealing with it, ignoring it, I don't know, depending on your situation or your approach or your opportunities, what have you. So I just find this to be a really interesting framework to think about things in, because honestly, sometimes these wicked problems can be so big, so, so complicated and interwoven that sometimes our go-to response can be just, well, it's somebody else's problem, right? Or I can't even get into that, or I don't even know how to get into it. I don't even know, how to address it. And so I think, it's valuable to think about it as, it is a wicked problem. There is no one single solution. So we'll come back to this a couple times as we go through the session tonight. So let's talk about the racial wealth gap now and dive in. And first, start from the very beginning. When we talk about wealth, what do we mean, right? So When we talk about wealth and when we measure wealth in particular, and by we, I mean the federal government and others, we tend to focus on a number being net worth. So most of you, I'm sure, know how to calculate net worth, but just as a reminder, got this little graphic, right? Net worth is everything that you own or have, your assets. So things like your home, any bank accounts, savings accounts, money that you have on hand that's easily, liquefied or liquid, or something that you can access easily. Retirement accounts, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, personal property, your vehicles, your other, belongings, minus everything that you owe. So all of your, your loans, credit obligations, credit cards, debt, what have you. So assets minus liabilities, what you own minus what you owe, gives you your net worth. And so when we look at and make these comparisons, we're really talking about net worth comparisons. So what does the latest data on this tell us? Well, it tells us, first of all, where does it come from? It comes from the data that we look at and we make these comparisons, and we look at this, comes from the Survey of Consumer Finance. And this is done every few years and issued, so the most recent one is 2019, before that was 2016. The data gets released and the numbers get crunched by the Federal Reserve and released to the public. So the most recent data that we have is 2019. And we can see here, this is just a quick snapshot summary, that white families have more wealth than Black, Hispanic, or other multiple race families in this last data capture. So how much of a difference? Well, it depends first on whether or not you're looking at median net worth or mean net worth. So some of you know that my background is as a math teacher. I always like to remind folks that median is middle, mean is average, right? So when we look at the median, we're talking about 50% of people are below that, 50% of people are above. So we are right smack dab in the middle, right? Mean, on the other hand, we add up the net worth of everybody from the bottom to the top, and we come up with an average dividing by the total number. And so the challenge with mean and using it in this context is that the folks who have an incredible, like huge figures for their net worth tend to skew this upwards, right? And so for the most part, we tend to look at median net worth on these as opposed to mean net worth. Does it mean that, or as a result, is there a gap in one and not in the other? No, there's still a gap in both, right? Very clearly, and we talk about the gap, and we'll look at this in a couple different ways. I'm going to slice and dice this several ways for you. This is what we're talking about, right? This huge gap between, in particular here, white families and Black families. So it is still a significant difference, but for the purpose of tonight, we're going to focus, for the most part, I'll come back up once or twice to mean, but we'll focus on median net worth. So this is an interesting graph. I will tell you that on this, I did take away the other category because I think it's sort of, actually somebody just asked that question. So other is, for the most part, Asian and mixed race families. For the sake of simplicity, I left it with these three, just a little bit easier to read. The link that I am sharing with you in the handout for this, by the way, this is a website where you can go through and you can create your own graph. So if you want to click on that other and add it back into the graph, go for it. And you can slice and dice this data and this information in many different ways. You can change the historical perspective. So like here, for example, I'm going back as far back as it went to 1989 in this. You can make this shorter, or do whatever you want to with it. These numbers, by the way, up here are in thousands of 2019 dollars. So this is already adjusted for inflation. So that's always, I think, something that's important to point out to students, and especially when we're looking at the reliability of data. Sometimes if it's not adjusted for inflation, it skews it already. So what we can see here is this is the gap that we're talking about, right? So the gap is one, persistent, but changing, right? So there have been times when the gap has been smaller and when the gap has been bigger. And here we are today. So, or most recently. So again, this is net worth by race or ethnicity, and this is the median. So this is the middle. Okay, so you can see that the net worth was high 2007. Any thoughts on why it dropped so much between then and 2010? Feel free to comment. I'm sure you guys can think back to what happened between 2007 and 2010. And then it's been creeping back up for white families and creeping up at a much lower rate for both Black and Hispanic families. So here's a different slicing and dicing of similar information. By the way, these two data sets, the first one comes from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. This one comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They admit that in some cases they're off a little bit because of who they classified as other and what have you in terms of race. They did it a little bit different. So if the numbers don't exactly align, that's why. And again, these are all linked for you. But this one, what we're seeing here is over time. So here we've got in median net worths of 143 versus 9,000 in 1989, and now most recently 184,000 versus 23,000 in 2019. So this is an interesting metric that I think is kind of fascinating. Overall, 82% of Black families had less wealth than the typical white family in 2019. That is little changed since 1989. So when they're talking about the typical white family, they're talking about that median. And so we think about what a large percentage of that is. So you're talking about the median level for the 50th percentile for white families and matches up with the 82nd percentile for Black families. So I think that's pretty substantial. And we look at that number has sort of adjusted up and down, but not necessarily, real significantly, certainly not significantly improved over that time period. I think sometimes this, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but I think sometimes it's hard to sort of conceptualize what this means. And so I actually put this graphic together. We think sometimes, we hear a lot about like the pay gap between men and women, right? And so we often hear that for the same job, frequently women are paid 84 cents on the dollar as opposed to their male counterparts. So I think that's powerful, right? 84 cents for every dollar that a man earns is, what women right now can kind of expect or are earning. That has like this, you get this visceral response. Okay, well, think about it like this. The median net worth for every dollar of median net worth of white families, Black families have 12 cents and Hispanic families have 21. So, I mean, that's basically a dime on every dollar, less than a quarter on every dollar for Hispanic families. That's a significant difference in accumulated net worth. So again, now this is the mean. So I said I share a little bit on this, but again, I don't think these numbers are quite as valuable, but certainly could be an interesting conversation with students about the difference and which one is is better to use, why or why not. But again, here a significant difference, and certainly you can see back in 1989, this one I would say, what you see a bigger appreciation or a bigger widening of the gap over time. So when we look at mean, what is that? What does the mean show us, or what does the mean mean? To me, this means that the highest, those that are accumulating the highest levels of wealth in our country are predominantly white. And so the people who are skewing these numbers, skewing the mean higher, you'll see them much more as white families than you do as Black families, and we'll show that the data supports that notion here in a minute. So again, showing this, sort of as a visual, white families for 980,000 in comparison to Black families, 143,000 in Hispanic. So this is, again, the mean versus the median. So when you take the absolute, wealthiest of the wealthy and you include them in and average them out, this is what happens. So these are not my words. These are the words of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis as a key takeaway. The wealth gap is large and unchanged over the last 30 years. And while it is less between white families and Hispanic families, it is still certainly large, and while slightly improved, still remains quite large. So when we talk about that distribution of wealth and the individuals who are at the highest level of the wealth in our country, I always use that analogy of slicing the pie, and here this one actually has a graphic of this money pie, which I of course love. Anyhow, so we see here this top 10%, all right, is this big, huge left-hand side here, right? So the top 10% of families owned 76% of the wealth in the country. That's 12.9 million families owned over 3/4 of the wealth in the country. So that's that concentration of wealth at the very top, right? So we've all heard this, right? But this is sort of a different visual. The next 40% is owned by, or next 40% of families owned 22% of the wealth. That's 51.5 million. The bottom 50% owned just 1% of the wealth. That's 64.3 million families. And of those, 13.4 million families in this group had a negative net worth. So that means when you take everything they own, you subtract what they owe, assets minus liabilities, you end up with a negative number. Okay, so that's pretty substantial. So let's look at this a little bit closer. What does it mean to have that much wealth? How do you get into each of these categories? So this 76% of the wealth, to fall into that category, it means you had a family net worth of $1.2 million or more. In this 40% or 22% of the wealth, that is a threshold of $122,000 in net worth, or $1.22 million. If, as a family, you have a net worth of $122,000 or less, you fall into this bottom 50%, which has just 1% of all wealth in the country. And so that's sort of how that all plays out. Let's take those two extremes and break them out just a little bit more and look at who's in those families. So when we look at the top 10%, all right, that's 76% of wealth, this is 13% of all wealth of all white families. So 100 white families, 13%, 13 of them are in this big piece of the pie that represents still only 10% of all families, but 76% of the wealth. If we take all of the Black families together, only 1% of them are in this bigger piece of the pie, as compared to 3% of Hispanic families. So again, the threshold is $1.2 million or more to be in this category. The average, however, in that group is $5.7 million in net worth. We look at the bottom part of the bottom 50%, the smallest slice of the pie. 41% of white families are in this piece of pie, as compared to 75% of Black families or 67% of Hispanic families. So again, I think that illustrates that gap. It shows where the concentration of wealth is and where it's not, and who makes up the people where the wealth is concentrated. And so again, this threshold was 122,000. The average net worth in this slice is 22,000. So I think that kind of speaks volumes there. So again, just sort of a summary there. The bottom percent still have modest wealth holdings, which makes it extremely difficult for them to weather financial emergencies and tough times. Hello, pandemic. Or to gain upward mobility even in good times. These findings underscore the importance of examining wealth by demographics. That again comes from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. So when we look at assets, right, and we had a little graphic of what includes assets: home ownership, cash, money in savings accounts and checking accounts, money that's invested, money in retirement accounts, personal property. So let's look at home ownership, which tends to be the greatest source of assets for many, many families. And when we look at this, even by age range, we can see that there's a gap, right? So we look here in the youngest of ages, under 35-year-olds in 2019. Keep in mind that, you know, our younger generation has been putting off home ownership, so this isn't really that surprising. And I think I like this one that breaks it down by age, because we know that people are putting off home ownership until later in life nowadays, as opposed to previous generations. So when we look at younger families under 35, white families, we're looking at about roughly 45, 46% are homeowners. Compare that to Black families, where we're looking about 16%. And then we have Hispanic and other. This gap continues to persist even across all of the age ranges. It doesn't really shrink anything, I would say, markedly, in particular between white and Black families. So we're going to sort of see this recurring theme, I guess, in some of the data. So this is, again, that percent of families that have a primary residence. So included in the data is also individuals that have secondary residences or vacation homes, what have you. So we're just looking at primary residence here. So back in 1989, about 70% of white families owned a home, as compared to about 40% of Black and Hispanic families. We get this to 2019, and these numbers have both increased some. They're still not to the 50th percentile. Meanwhile, the rate of home ownership for white families is still pretty significantly higher, and this has kind of consistently maintained that gap over time. Now, this is also talking about primary residences, but in this case, we're talking not about the percentage of families that own them, but the value of the homes that they own. So in this case, we can see that the value of homes owned by white families was approximately $150,000 in 1989 on average, versus now roughly around $225,000, peaking before the financial crisis in 2008 or so, and then falling as a result, and then rebounding, not quite to the same level, but certainly rebounding over time. So what we see here is that if we go back to the previous slide, white families are a higher percentage of white families own property, own homes, and the homes that they own are worth more than those of Black families. So on the flip side, what about the mortgages? So this one also is interesting, I think, when we look at the thousands of dollars. So even though those homes are significantly less lower in value, the mortgages, the amount of the mortgages, or the amount of money that's owed on them, is not that different, and that, I think, is pretty significant when we look over there. So what about vehicles, for example? Okay, well, same kind of deal. Almost 90% or so of white families own a vehicle, versus around 71, 72% of Black non-Hispanic families, and eking up here closer to 85% for Hispanic families. So this is one where there's been some change over time, but still, significant gap. And just as we saw with homes, the value, higher percentage of white families own a car, and the ones that they do are worth more than the ones that are owned by Black families. Retirement counts. So no surprise here again, unfortunately. The data just continues to show that there is gap after gap after gap. So this is retirement account ownership. So this is the percent of families, percent of white families here, for example, percent of Black families under 35 that have a retirement account, okay? So again, we would expect or would hope that individuals by age 35 to 54 would be more likely to have them, but we still see that gap persists. This is one of those where Hispanic families have a lower percentage or a larger gap between white families than Black families do. So again, we see that significant gap again holding over time. And so again, this is just put over time or over the same time period going back to 1989. Big gap then, continued gap over time, continued with a gap still now. And just like we look at with homes, not only do more white families have retirement accounts, the value of the money that's in them is bigger or greater than it is for accounts that are owned by Black and Hispanic families. So again, it's that, that same thing over and over again. Might have more, or they both, white families have more or more likely to have those accounts, but the value that's in them is likely to be higher. So this tracks right along with other assets. So this comes from a different report, but still similar, from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, where this one looks at home ownership, which we've talked about, but also business ownership. And then here was defined contribution retirement accounts all the way over on the right, and then the difference in ownership rates. Participation rates of stock fund and mutual fund. We see that again, this persistent gap here all the way across the board. This here is the median value, so the middle value. Again, we see these consistent gaps occurring here. So it's sort of a variation on a theme, unfortunately. So Black and Hispanic families are less likely than white families to own various types of assets and have lower valued assets when they do. So that summarizes all of those different graphs that we just looked at. This was a fascinating quote. It's actually at the very beginning of one of the books that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. It's called The Color of Money. And this is, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. And I think that's a quote that has stood the test of time, unfortunately. So what about education? So, when we started thinking about, well, what if we disaggregated the data, right? What if we looked at it from different places, or we slice and dice this again different ways? Surely having more education means that you're going to accumulate more wealth. And so if we just looked at individuals and families that have somebody that has a bachelor's degree or has their doctorate, then surely the gap shrinks, right? Because they've received more education. That would be great. And unfortunately, it's not. So even if when we take into consider education levels, look here, for example, at the accumulation, again, net worth in thousands of dollars, comparing families with an individual. This is the person with the most education in the household. So we look at this gap here, and boy, I mean, it's staggering. I mean, you're looking at like almost 6 times, 5.5 times. I mean, that's just tremendous. So we would like to think that if you compared apples to apples, maybe that the gap shrinks. No, it doesn't. It actually does the complete opposite. So this one is again, this one is I can't find the same style of table from 2019. This is based on the 2016 data. If you remember back, it didn't really change a whole lot in between. So this again just shows specifically that gap at each of those different levels, just a little bit different of a visual. So that we might hope that education is a great equalizer. Unfortunately, going to college and education does not eliminate or substantially reduce the racial or ethnic wealth gaps that exist and persist across our country. So what else is in play? Well, one of the really big pieces, we talk about, big pieces or big components of people's net worth, or things like their their home, their ownership in the home, the fact that they're saving money and putting that money away as they get more education and what have you. So we've discussed that part, but then there's this big piece, and that is the intergenerational transfer of wealth, and that is one of the areas where Black and Hispanic families really are challenged because there is much less wealth to be passed down, and so we see this, generational almost compounding, if you will, of this challenge, because you see so many more white families receiving an inheritance, and the amount of that inheritance being considerably larger. And there's lots of additional data on that as well. And again, this just sort of points to that historical barriers that continue to hamper Black and Hispanic wealth accumulation across our country. So if you have some questions, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. Feel free to pop those in, but we're going to move from sort of where we are in this picture of the wealth gap to root causes, and then turn our attention to the role of financial education. So I said before, I could spend hours and hours or weeks and weeks on this topic. This slide I'm going to leave on the screen for a minute, because I just want you to look through, and I want you to kind of look at that and say, yeah, I get that one. I get that one. I don't understand that one. The ones that you don't understand, or that you don't know how they might impact or be a root cause of the wealth gap, those are the ones I really want you to note and say, like, hey, I need to understand this better. So read through those bullets. If you're not sure how they relate, this is your chance to make that note. And I'm going to share with you a bunch of different resources where you can start, digging around for information. But, there's a whole lot of great information now out there. I can tell you, as someone who was raised and received the majority of my education in Virginia, I didn't hear much about almost any of these. Certainly understood slavery, heard about Jim Crow, had heard about 40 acres and a mule. I confess I never heard about the Freedmen's Bank until much, much later, well into my career in financial education. I had a lot to learn about that story. That's really a big part of this book, in particular, Black banks and the racial wealth gap, in the history of financial institutions created for and or by Black individuals, sharecropping, and the Tulsa Race Massacre, which I think the vast majority of individuals were just completely blown away or learning about just in the past few years. The New Deal, which created, amongst other things, the FHA, or the Federal Housing Administration. One of the first things you might think about is redlining, for example, that came from that. But there's a host of other complex issues. The GI Bill, which was completely discriminatory in terms of who got their education funded and who did not. And so this is, just an abbreviated list, quite frankly. And these are, the ones that are, certainly things that are sort of may or may not be in our history books, but certainly things that are worthwhile to go back and educate yourself about, to better understand these historic root causes. So let's take a look at a couple of places where you can go. These are linked. I actually thought it was really fascinating that I found information on the racial wealth gap and its causes and the history behind it on Investopedia, which is considered a very sort of neutral website. So a great place, and with lots of different hyperlinks to additional sources of data and information. A couple of videos. These are actually linked and referenced in one of the educational resources that I'll share with you in a few minutes, but this one on racist banking policies, keeping Black Americans from prospering, housing segregation. This one, I think, would really appeal to students. It's very kind of TikTok-y, if you will, as a video there. So I want to circle back a little bit on this wicked problem notion. There is always more than one explanation, and certainly that is the case with the wealth gap. There are so many different ways to explain this. And a wicked problem is a symptom of another problem, right? So discrimination, racism, redlining, all of those different things. This wicked problem of the wealth gap is a symptom of many of those other problems, both historic and contemporary. So beyond wealth, we can look at all sorts of other, things that this bleeds into, right? Income disparity, discrimination in banking, unbanked individuals, families that do or don't have accounts with mainstream financial education, requirements for financial education, who isn't required to take courses in personal finance, levels of financial literacy. Somebody pointed out in the chat, does extensive student loan debt account in part for the failure of college education to narrow the wealth gap? Yeah, actually, I had to cut some content, and one of them was on the percent of students who complete college, for example. Many students who get themselves into debt and have to drop out of college for one of a host of reasons. So they never get that degree, but they've got the debt, and that doesn't benefit them in the long run. And that is a huge gap between white students and Black students, and who that happens to. So many different components to all of this, right? That's what makes it wicked. And sometimes, I talked about, like, it's hard to wrap our arms around it sometimes. And as a result, we might just want to say, hey, I can't even go there, but we need to go there. And so let's take a look at some of these. So this is the income disparity. So we're looking at from 2000 to 2018. This is adjusted again for inflation. We see that the average income for Black individuals fell while it rose for white and Hispanic individuals. So they still earn less than they did in 2000. This is about racial discrimination in U.S. home loans and the difference in interest rate that is charged. And I'll come back to this in a minute as well with some interesting tidbits. But minority-based borrowers pay on average 7.9 basis points more for their first home mortgage purchase. The gap is larger when they use face-to-face lenders rather than algorithm-based lenders. And again, I'll come back to a interesting story that you can share with students and sort of dissect at the end. The rates of the unbanked, and I've talked a little bit about the unbanked population, what that means. So that's individuals, again, who don't have a relationship, don't have an account in a mainstream financial institutions. Back when I taught, I had my students were majority minority, right? I taught in an urban school where the majority of my students were minorities, so Black, Hispanic students for the most part, and the vast majority of those students were unbanked. Their parents did not have bank accounts. They as a general rule, distrusted financial institutions. There weren't banks or credit unions in their communities to go to. Instead, on every corner, you can find a check casher, a payday lender, et cetera. And so this is, when we look at this statistic, for example, 86.2% of Black families or households had a bank account as opposed to 97.5%. This gap may not seem that big, but when you think about this is households with a checking account. All right, we're not talking about, we would think, most of us would think that nowadays in 2022, or in this case 2019, that nearly every single household would have access to a checking account, would have a bank account, right? Not the case. And it is, while it is very, very close to 100% of white families, it is much less over here when we look in particular at Black and Hispanic families. So what about financial education? So the Next Gen Personal Finance, or NGPF, has taken a look and tried to break down the information on districts that have courses where districts require courses in personal finance, and they find that many fewer Black and Brown students, Black and Hispanic students, are required to take a standalone course in personal finance. When they look at adults, this comes from a study from TIA Institute and GFLAC, the Global Financial Education, Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center. We see that there's a persistent gap in financial knowledge, and that runs across all these different categories. So the highest percent is in borrowing, but we still see this incredible gap, right? And the lowest level of knowledge, or the most number of questions missed, I guess, is in insuring and protecting assets. So, definitely huge room for growth in that case. And so that kind of leads us, I think, naturally to this idea of what is the role of financial education? And does financial education play a role? Should it? Could it? What difference would it make? And so, like we talked about before, wicked problems don't have silver bullet answers, right? And solutions can only be good or bad, not true or false. So let's take a look at some of these points of view. So this comes from CNBC, and there's a video here featuring Sharon Epperson talking about financial education. Teaching personal finance to kids can help to close the Black wealth gap, is the heading on this one. And again, I've linked to these along with this one. This is an opinion piece from USA Today, in which Yaneli Espinal from NGPF wrote this. To start closing the Black wealth gap, teach personal finance to high school students. And she talks about how, personal finance can be a great equalizer, a course in personal finance, because without this information, you don't necessarily know how to establish wealth, right? And historically, these types of lessons have been reserved for the wealthy, who are not commonly people of color. She references the fact that there's no single explanation for the wealth gap, and as similarly, there's no single solution. So she's not saying that this is the end all be all solution to the wealth gap, but that it certainly is time for our country to prevent the wealth gap from further expansion. This takes a slightly different take, if you will. This is from the Heckinger report. Again, another opinion piece. Heckinger is voted solely to education in this case, but this is that there's an underlying assumption that the Black wealth gap is a product of Black ignorance. And I think what we can see is that while there may be a difference in the financial literacy, that it's absurd to maintain that doing so will close the wealth gap. And so this is an interesting piece here. Black people can save every discretionary cent for the next 250 years, and it would still not close the racial wealth gap in this country. And so certainly lots of food for thought. Another point of view coming from the center, the Samuel Savoy Cook Center on Social Equity from Duke University, the political economy of education, financial literacy, and the racial wealth gap. So another report that I think is really interesting to dive into. And so then we got to my disclaimer. So everything before has been other people's views or just data that I'm sharing. And I want to just qualify that these next few slides in particular are my own personal point of view. They don't necessarily reflect the policy or position of Making Sense Project, Penn State, or the Department of Education. So what are some of my thoughts? I've got a few thoughts on these, unfortunately. We've thrown a lot into this. I could probably spend an hour just on this, but my notion is financial education can't hurt, right? Like it certainly isn't the solution, but it can be used to help individuals, and in particular individual students, make more informed decisions. So we may not be able as a single individual to tip the scale and change the entire landscape of this wicked problem, but kind of like that, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? The fact that it's massive and huge shouldn't stop us from trying. And so I often use a couple of these phrases that are often heard if you spend time with me. It is what it is, right? Like the wealth gap is what it is. It's a huge gap in wealth accumulation. We shouldn't ignore it. Teach students about the wealth gap and its causes. Be upfront. Don't dust it, sweep it under the rug. It's a fact. In particular, we've talked about, and I've talked about with educators for years about how there isn't necessarily a one size fits all approach to financial education, right? I've driven up to schools and talked to teachers where they live in a community where all of the students like drive nicer cars than all of the teachers, right? when your students all have, parents who have accountants and financial advisors and what have you, sometimes those lessons and the tone of your lessons takes a different a different approach. I remember somebody talking about some resources or a lesson that was about prom and about like the average expense for prom, and a teacher has told me, well, you know what, my kids go to like a dress closet where they get donated dresses. So like this idea of spending all this money on prom dresses is different. If you have students that are, in particular, if you have Black and Hispanic students and you're not talking about this, I think you're doing them a disservice. I also think you're doing a disservice to white students in not acknowledging the elephant that's in the room. And so, while I think this can be for these students in particular that are impacted the most, it doesn't mean that those are the only students that can benefit from understanding it. So knowledge is power, discrimination exists. There's study after study that shows it. Some of them are linked here. Teach students in particular, for example, not to disclose their race when applying for credit. And in order to do that, it's a lot better to apply online than it is face-to-face, because it's a lot easier to hide your race when you're doing it from behind a screen or on your phone than it is face-to-face. And I've linked to an article from Michelle Singletary, some data on the disparity and the discrimination that exists in lending, and there's a story I'll share here at the end. Teach every student to save early and often, to invest, to consider home ownership, to strive for transfer of wealth if they can down the road. Talk about what wealth is and their values associated with it. I don't want to, I don't think you can do this right now without addressing the fact that today's educational climate in our country as a whole is tricky. Still try. Right? Like, it is what it is, and you can do hard things, are things we say a lot around here. Something might be hard. It doesn't mean that you don't try and do it. So I encourage you to think about this as something that you can still try, even though it is tricky. Your students can do hard things, right? Modern society is tricky. Don't let the fact that there is this persistent wealth gap get them down. Try, even if, or perhaps especially when the deck is stacked against you. Prove them wrong, show them that you can make a difference, that you're not necessarily going to be one of those statistics. You're going to be the student, you're going to be the kid that turns that tide, the family that turns that tide. And, it is, in some cases, it's an aspirational piece, right? If nobody expects you to be able to do it, if nobody encourages you to be able to do it, we all know that students very often come up to the level that we expect, and so we can expect them to do great things. So my encouragement to you is to make a difference in all that you do, as you already do, but to be that change that you want to see in the world, both for yourself and for students. So I'm just going to fly through these very quickly. There's lots of this linked in the handout, and I'll be sharing my slides online as well as a follow-up, or you're welcome to email me if you'd like these. But NGPF has done a great job putting together a mini unit on racial discrimination in finance. It addresses some of these topics, in particular, some of these things about like, where do I even get started talking about it? I'm not sure I'm ready. There's some virtual PD that they offer as well. Their unit follows a variety of different topics, has some great resources in it that I'd encourage you to check out. There's some reading materials that can be used in class or just for your own benefit. This is a interactive virtual version of an exhibit at the Money Museum from the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. These are a series of lessons that were shared on Facebook in the FinLit Fanatics with NGPF group from a teacher out in Illinois on the Black Wall Street massacre. Some great resources. This comes from Vox. There's a great video. This is from The Atlantic. There's an article from Forbes. There's a project with a rubric with some great questions. There's a lot of places to turn for information. Some of it is very, I would say, sort of academic. This one certainly is, puts forward a bunch of ideas about how to address the racial wealth gap and build wealth. This, I think, is a really fascinating look from McKinsey, which is a really well-respected consulting company that takes a look at the economic impact of closing the racial wealth gap and sort of that notion of a rising tide lifts all boats, right? And so I think this is really fascinating, especially if you want to take a look at it sort of from the policy perspective. If you want to understand the history, this is the book that I mentioned earlier, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. From the same author comes How the Other Half Banks, another really good one about the challenges that not just this one is really more about individuals of low wealth across all demographics. So really interesting. The Color of Law isn't just about finances, but this one is about segregation, and in particular goes into some of that redlining piece, which is certainly that home ownership being such a large component of wealth is important. So Segregated by Design is a website with about 17-minute video that's based on that book. Really, really interesting to watch. If you teach in an urban area, I know we've got some teachers from Philadelphia, check out this one from Brookings on access to financial institutions. This is just, I think this definitely holds. When the Office of Financial Education was established and I was leading that under the Rendell administration, I worked in the banking department, and my eyes were really just opened to how pervasive the issue of access to good financial services and traditional financial services is in many communities. If you want something that's a little bit that's a documentary, or not a documentary, this is a feature film on Apple TV Plus that is based on a true story of two entrepreneurs, and it is excellent. It's rated PG-13. It's got some language in it, but I would love if anybody wants to talk about how to use this in a classroom, thinking about putting together a discussion guide. The only one I can find is out there on Teachers Pay Teachers, and I don't think it's focused on financial education, but this is excellent, excellent, excellent. I encourage you to take the time to watch that, find somebody with an account and use it. This is that one that I was referencing earlier, A Troubling Tale of a Black Man Trying to Refinance His Mortgage. And it tells the story of this individual who has a six-figure salary and 800 FICO credit score and 20% equity in his home that right now is owned because at the time it was they purchased it. It was the mortgage, the primary mortgage is in his girlfriend's name, who's a white female. She's consulting. He goes to try and refinance. He has the steady income and the best credit, and he has a horrible time. And it's just it's a good illustration of the challenges that individuals continue to face when it comes to building wealth. Mapping inequality. This goes back to that notion of redlining. I found this site from the from the University of Richmond, all these different cities in Philadelphia and their old historic redlining maps. I was able to look at this. This is Harrisburg, which is just down the, really just down the road, below down like here on that one. So I can go through here and look and say, oh yeah, I know exactly where that is, and it's fascinating to look at that from a mapping standpoint and the impact now. So I want to leave us with this. I know I'm a few minutes over time, apologize, but I didn't think it would be, I wanted to just explicitly say this webinar is taking place in February, but I don't want anybody to think about this as sort of that token Black History Month kind of lesson. It isn't, and it shouldn't be. This is just where it happened to land in the series. I wanted to give folks enough time they could still do something with it this year if you're interested in diving in. But I certainly don't think that these should be token lessons that we do just to check a box. These are things that we should really think about how we integrate and how we talk about across the curriculum, and how we can do that with purpose and with meaning. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for participating tonight. I know I sent so much information your way. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming, and I appreciate those of you who are commenting and providing questions in the chat. So thank you so much, and I hope that you'll follow up with this information and explore a lot of these resources on your own time as you have time available.